down here. I hope it may. Yeah. But I'm glad you guys can understand me. All right. Well, tonight we're going to kick off, or not kick off, we're going to continue in our series on relationships. I think it was 4 weeks ago, we kicked off the series. We talked about friends. We talked about how choosing our friends is so important because our friends will either draw us closer to God or they'll pull us farther away from God. The following week, we talked about parents. We talked about how we need to love and honor our parents and obey them, like the scripture says. Even when we're adults, we're still called to honor our parents and how that relationship is so important. 2 weeks ago, we talked about dating. We talked about purity and just how important it is that we date Christians, people who are pursuing Christ as we should be. And the same thing with friends. People we date will either draw us closer to God or they'll push us farther away from God. Tonight we're going to talk about being an example. That first week we talked about the impact that friends have on us. Well, tonight we're going to talk about the impact that we can have on other people by the way we live our lives. And I'm going to teach you guys about one of my favorite verses in the Bible. It's 1 Timothy 4:12. But before we get into that verse, I want to give you a little overview of Paul and Timothy. 1st and 2nd Timothy was written by the Apostle Paul. The Apostle Paul was sitting in jail when he penned these letters. Timothy was like a son to Paul. On his, I believe it was his second missionary journey, Paul stopped in a city called Lystra, and that's where Timothy was born and raised. And scholars speculate that Timothy actually gave his life to Jesus through the ministry of Paul. And then when Paul came back through, he saw the great leadership qualities that Timothy had in his life, how on fire he was for Jesus. And so he brought Timothy alongside of him, and he ministered alongside with Paul and Timothy. Paul was the mentor. Timothy was the mentoree. Is that the proper word, Lisa? Mentee? Is that like Mentos? Mentee. Oh, gosh. So Paul took Timothy under his wing, and he taught him how to minister. Well, then they end up in a city called Ephesus. How many of you guys were in any of the Sunday school classes that I taught on Ephesians? What modern-day country is Ephesus located in? Turkey. Lystra was also in current-day Turkey. So it's real close. What part of Turkey, modern-day Turkey, is Ephesus located on? Like what part of the country? Anybody remember the specific details on that? It was it was a port city. It was on the west coast of Turkey. Anybody else remember any of the things we talked about Ephesus? What made it stand out? The second biggest city. It was the second biggest city on the planet. You remember how many people were in it? Who lived in it at the time? It was smaller than Pittsburgh. 250,000 people. And it was the second biggest city at the time, 2,000 years ago, roughly. Smaller than Pittsburgh, and it was the second largest city. And isn't that kind of blows your mind? 250,000 people. But it was known for its vast wealth. I mean, people were loaded there, and with that came some bad stuff as well. But business was booming in Ephesus. So Paul started the church in Ephesus, and then he handed that over to Timothy. And Timothy was a young man to be a pastor. Back then, people think that he was probably in his late teens, early 20s when Paul took him along, put his arm around him and taught him how to do everything. By the time 1st and 2nd Timothy was written, he was probably in his early 30s. But back then, it was unheard of for a man that young to be a pastor. So I'm sure some people who are older probably look down on him because of his youth, and that's the verse we're going to get into tonight. Timothy was going through a tough time. Because Ephesus was very wealthy, their god was their money. They were very materialistic. Also, there were a lot of pagan gods that people worshipped. Sexual immorality was just running rampant there. And probably the most difficult obstacle Timothy had was that some of the leaders of his church began with some false teachings. They started going around and twisting the gospel and were dividing his church. So there's Timothy, this young man, and he's got all this stuff going on while his mentor is in prison. And so Paul's writing him these letters saying, if you look for church leadership, these are the books you want to go to. And then the second Timothy, I think, was written 4 years after First Timothy, a letter he wrote to Timothy. It talks about how to keep the church together and not to have false teaching. Make sure your teaching is solid. So we're going to get into 1 Timothy 4:12 tonight. And like I said, it's one of my favorite verses of the Bible. If we could go to the scripture up on the screen. 1 Timothy 4:12. Don't let anyone think less of you because you are young. Be an example to all believers in what you say, in the way you live, in your love, your faith, in your purity. So Paul was telling Timothy, look, people are probably going to look down upon you because of your youth. I mean, it sounds crazy. Someone in their young 30s. When I was 30, I thought it was like an old man. When I turned 30, I was like depressed when I turned 30. Now, he was a young pup to be a pastor. So he's like, look, people are going to look down on you, but you don't allow them to look down on you, but set an example by the way you live your life. The word example, it's from the Greek word tupos. And it's always good to look at the Greek. I know it's know many high school students who look into the Greek, but if you look at the Greek, the word's tupos, and it means to model, to imprint, to stamp. If we go to the next slide, I think it says stamp, and then go to the next slide. The people who worked with metal, blacksmiths, whenever they would create something, a lot of them had their own little symbol. It might be the letters of their name, it could be a picture, but they would imprint their stamp on their work. So when you saw their work, you knew who created that. They left their mark on their work. And that's what Paul's telling Timothy, look, set an example for these people, meaning leave a mark on someone's life by the way you live yours. Imprint on their lives. And then the next, it also means the model, which is the next slide here. We need to be a model to people. Paul's telling Timothy to do that, and we need to do that as well. Like I said, the first week in this series, we talked about the impact friends have on our lives. Now we're talking about the impact we have on other people by the way we live our life. Because I've known people in my life who talk a big game, especially when it comes to their faith, but their actions totally contradict what their mouth says. You ever heard the saying, talk the talk, don't just talk the talk, walk the walk? I mean, that's what we're talking about here. Paul gives 5 ways that we need to be an example. 5 ways that, and what we say is the first one. I don't know, guys. I've been a believer for almost 28 years, and I come from a family that, we didn't go to church, and a lot of my family members still don't. And I find that not only some of the people in my family, but other people I know who aren't believers, their biggest cop-out for not being a Christian is hypocrites, they would say. People who proclaim Christ with their lips and then deny him with their lives. They say one thing, but they act a whole different way. They're like, well, why should I come to know Jesus when I act better than they do? These people who go to church every Sunday, who are involved in the church, when they're stabbing people in the back, they're the biggest gossipers. That's straight from one of my family members who these people worked for him. And, he said those are the nastiest people in my school, or the people who go to church every Sunday. And it just happened to be the church that Scott and I grew up in, so it really broke my heart when I'd hear that. But people will use that as an excuse to not come to know Jesus. Well, why should it become that when they talk like this or they act like that? What do we say? Does our speech, do we lift people up with our speech, or do we tear them down? Have you ever been around people who you're around them and when you leave you just feel so uplifted? You know anyone? The person that comes to my mind is Pastor Rich, and I know Abby's here. It's like he makes me feel guilty because he's always up here. I mean, I'm a moody dude. I mean, most people know that who know me well. And she's just like, yep. I can be moody. I wear my emotions on my sleeve. When I'm down, you're gonna know I'm down. When I'm in a bad mood, you're gonna know I'm in a bad mood. I'm not good at putting on a mask. I've never seen Pastor Rich down, and from everyone I've heard who's been around him a lot more, they've never seen him that way. I'm not going to ask Abby if he's ever been like that at home, because everyone's got to have a weak moment. But Pastor Rich, the times I've gone out to eat with him, he just talks to everybody in the restaurant and, introduces himself. And I'm so envious, but then I feel guilty. I'm like, man, he's so bubbly, so positive all the time. And I'm Mr. Downer probably at least a third of the time, or I can be. But yeah, I mean, the way we say, I mean, do we lift people up? Or, you've been around the opposite type of people, right? You're around and they're like Debbie Downer. You ever seen a Saturday Night Live skit with Debbie Downer? It's like everything, like they're like trying to have like a party or something. She just, everything she says, something about 9/11 or something, something to just totally bring down, a real bummer, There's people like that too, where you leave, you're like, oh my gosh, I just want to go like, jump off a cliff after being around this person. But I mean, what we say, it impacts people. It does. It really does. And I know because I've inflicted pain with my words, and I know I've encouraged some people with my words, but we have to be careful. We need to set an example for people in the way we talk, in the way we live. You ever heard the word character before? It's who we are when no one's looking. Have you ever heard that term before? I mean, who are we really? I mean, it's one thing to come to church and be like on your best behavior, but who are we when there's no one around to impress? The way we live our life. Do we have principles? Do we have, black and white principles where you're not willing, no, that's non-negotiable. I am not going to do this, and I'm going to do this. And this kind of came when I was preparing this. What would someone say about you at your funeral? I think about that often. What would somebody come up and speak about my life? I hope that they have some people maybe from my past youth groups who's like, man, yeah, his ministry changed my life, or God used him to change my life. But I know there could be some other people up there who'd be like, yeah, this dude really, ticked me off a few times. I mean, what would people say about our funeral, or at our funeral, about us? The third one, we need to set example in our love. How do we treat other people? How do you treat that person in your lunchroom that has no friends? That person who doesn't fit in? Are you with the other group that just makes fun of them? Or do you go over and say, hey, why don't you come sit with us? Or go actually remove yourself from the group and go sit with them, even if your group doesn't want to be with them. And I just thought of this, but I don't want to put JJ on the spot. But yeah, I mean, he eats with somebody every day, and it's just he and this other kid because his other group of friends, he doesn't mix well with them. And I'm like, man, Jay, that's a big sacrifice. But JJ does it. I mean, I don't know if I would have done that at his age. I really don't. How do we treat other people? How do we treat our family members? How do we treat other people in the church? How do we treat our neighbors, people we might work with, people on our sports teams? How do we treat those people? Is our focus on other people or ourselves? What's Jesus say? That we need to love him with all of our hearts, and what else? What's the second commandment he gives? Love what? Love our neighbors. Love other people as ourselves. I couldn't hear. My ears are so swollen right now. All right. I don't know if... do we focus on other people or ourselves? Because I tell you what, I mean, I just see more and more of this world. Everyone's just so self-absorbed. They just worry about themselves, and they don't care about loving other people. We need to set an example in our faith. When people look at our faith, what does it say about our faith in God? Are we easily shaken? When tough times come in your life, and guys, how many of you guys have had tough times in your life? I'm going to raise my hand super high. When the tough times come, is your faith shaken, or is it still rock solid? There have been times I've been angry at God. The first 2 years after I stepped down from my ministry, and we moved here, and I had no friends, and I was in excruciating pain, and didn't have me on the right medication, I was angry at God, to the point where I was sitting there trying to do my devotions. I'm like, God, I'm just going through the motions here. I'm doing this because I'm supposed to do it. I don't want to be doing it, so I quit doing it. I was angry at him. I still loved him. There's times I get angry at Lisa, and she gets angry at me, but we still love each other. There's times I get angry at my kids, but I still love them. I'd die for them. I mean, I still loved God, but I was angry. I was questioning him. I hear people say, well, I've never heard that person say, why me? Well, I said it about 1 million times. I'll admit it. I said, why me? Because I was ticked off. I was like, God, I could be serving right now, and why am I not? I mean, I did that. Is our faith easily shaken? Because that speaks volumes when we're going through tough times. And people say, man, he still loves God. He's still walking with him. Because I tell you, I've seen people just completely turn their backs on God the minute things get rough. And they're going to get rough. And then in our purity, the fifth point. We talked about this 2 weeks ago. Are we living pure lives? Or do we have our lives filled with some stuff that's impure? Are we looking at things we shouldn't be looking at? Thinking things about the opposite sex that we shouldn't be thinking? Or other people? Do we have garbage in our lives that needs to be cleaned out? Are we living pure lives? Like I said, Ephesus was filled with sexual immorality. And Timothy, I'm sure, was involved, dealing with this all the time in his church. And Paul's saying, look, you've got to set the example of living a pure life. And if we are doing the same kind of garbage, have that same garbage in our life that people who aren't believers have, that's not a good thing. We've got to set the example. And so Timothy was to demonstrate that in his life. I know I covered a lot of it, Lisa. We were going to should we still break them up, you think? Okay. You want to come up and lead it? Or we're going to break you guys up in some small groups, not your typical small groups, but we're going to have each group take one of these, and we want you guys to talk about for maybe 10 minutes, 5-10 minutes, talk about, go ahead, Lisa. I'll just give it.